Hello, everyone, and thanks for joining us this afternoon. It's great to be able to be hosting another event in the series. My name's Tim Vorley. I'm Pro Vice Chancellor and Dean at Oxford Brookes Business School, and this afternoon's session is going to be focusing on really the role of small businesses as part of the space economy. So hopefully that means that everyone's in the right place. So as many of you will have seen, the kind of recent reports on the size and health of the space sector have seen the number of firms quadruple since 2014. And many of those businesses that have been part of that growth are small businesses. So it's really important that we understand how to support and scale up some of these businesses. And this afternoon, we've got four great speakers that are going to bring different perspectives on those growth challenges. I'll introduce the speakers as we come to them in turn, but the four speakers are Colin Baldwin, Alan Cross, Shirley Harrison, and Andy Butt. And what we're going to be talking about this afternoon is really how we can think about support and really grow those small businesses as part of the space economy. Some of the work that I've been involved with as part of the Innovation Caucus has been calling for what we've been thinking of as connected clusters, trying to grow the UK space economy rather than simply trying to grow independent space clusters around the UK. So certainly the work that's been done in this area highlights the opportunity as part of the UK space economy. And so I would encourage all of you here joining us, whether LinkedIn, Facebook or direct, please put your questions in the chat. We will have an opportunity to ask all of our guests this afternoon questions directly, but I've asked them all in turn to provide a bit of reflection on their own experience and perspective on the space economy to get us kicked off. So I'm delighted to hand over to our first speaker this afternoon. So Colin Baldwin is Head of Policy at UK Space, previously working with UK Space Agency and also the SatApps Catapult as well. A huge advocate of knowledge transfer within the space sector and someone who has and is able to give us that bird's eye view of the space economy. So Colin, I'm going to hand over to you for some opening remarks. So thank you very much.
Great, thank you, Tim, and hello, everyone. As I've just literally moved in the last month from my role in government to the Trade Association, a lot of people have been telling me that I'm a gamekeeper turned poacher, but I think that provides me with a good opportunity to provide my own reflections on the UK space economy and policy priorities for SMEs. I think it's fair to say that SMEs play a really essential role in the UK space economy. There are about 1,300 organisations in the UK sector, and there's been a really rapid growth with representation across the whole of the country. The UK sector has quite a different composition to other countries, so we have fewer big primes and a much larger number of micro, small and medium enterprises. So we really need to take their needs into account as we're developing and implementing policy. And we know that within the space sector, SMEs drive innovation and new thinking, and in particular, provide those links to other sectors, and SMEs deliver huge benefits to society. And the growth of regional programs that I was involved in the Space Agency has certainly increased awareness and helped to reduce some of the barriers to entry for SMEs wanting to get involved in space. And what's great is we're starting to see an increased number of space startups beginning to scale, receiving increased private investment and employing more staff, and therefore driving economic growth. So the UK published its National Space Strategy last September, and it was a real step forward for the UK. It set a really ambitious vision for the UK's future in space. For the first time, it set out a whole of government view across the civil and defence departments and across users, regulators, and those focused on science and industry. And this opens the door to a clearer role for space to provide benefit to and receive benefit from wider government policy objectives. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later. As space SMEs operate across most, if not all, of the space value chain, from rocket components to farm productivity analysis. And therefore, they're really well placed to deliver across the government's objectives in the National Space Strategy and in the Defence Space Strategy. But there's always a but. And when you look at the National Space Strategy, it only makes one explicit mention of SMEs. And of course, whilst it sets out a high-level ambition and a framework, these ambitions will only be achieved as a result of industry investing in skills, capabilities, and programs. And industry can't plan and invest in isolation. So the National Space Strategy is a really important step forward. But industry wants a rapid translation of that strategy into a shared action plan that recognises where industry, including SMEs, can play their part. And what we also want to see is visibility of much longer term roadmaps and support programs, and a stronger focus on supply chains, which will all help SMEs to play the active role that they want to play in delivering the National Space Strategy. And whilst, as I said, there is only one explicit mention of SMEs within the strategy, there is a lot of broad messaging that's very positive for space SMEs. The government wants to make the UK one of the most attractive countries for space sector businesses of all sizes, and to grow and to thrive and to employ more talent. It's said that government will back businesses to develop new commercial opportunities. It will be much clearer on requirements and consider how these could be procured, which has been a long-standing request from the space sector. Grants are really helpful for SMEs and wider industry to help develop new technology and bring it up the TRL level. But actually providing the certainty of procurement is really important when you're trying to export these products and services. And the strategy also says it will support businesses across the whole growth life cycle, recognizing that there are different needs between startups, SMEs, and the larger players. And I said earlier, more broadly, the strategy and an action plan will also help to provide a real opportunity for the government to fully understand how space can support delivery of much wider government priorities. So priorities such as climate change, levelling up, innovation and the skills agenda, and also how we can deliver future transport solutions and so on. And all of this will have real positive benefits for existing space SMEs and for those venturing into the sector. So as an example, when we consider levelling up, the work that the UK Space Agency and Satellite Applications Catapult has led over the past couple of years to grow the sector's regional footprint has really raised awareness of space in industry and in local decision makers. It's reduced barriers to entry and led to a far more detailed understanding of the UK's full capabilities and how they operate as a supply chain. And I'm not going to go much further on that because I know Alan will bring that to life with his experiences in the Northwest. So just to conclude, space SMEs are really driving innovation, as I said, across the whole space value chain. They're leading work to explore how we can better use the space environment to develop new materials, how we clean up the space environment and make sure that it's safe for future missions, how we better understand and mitigate climate change, and how we deliver better services to citizens and to government. They provide a huge amount of high quality employment. And what's more inspiring for young people than knowing that there is a space company around the corner where they could work in the future. And I'm really lucky. I live in Alton in Hampshire, and In Space Missions has established in Alton and is a really shining example of that innovative SME approach and how it creates real value. So the National Space Strategy has really set out the UK's ambition, and in implementation terms, we're now in what they're calling the ignition phase and getting ready for takeoff. So I think the next few years are really going to be a very exciting time for the space sector and for small companies wanting to engage and grow their companies in space. So I'm going to finish there and hand back to Tim. Thank you.
Lovely. Thank you very much, Colin. Loads of issues in there that I think we can unpack as the conversation goes on, ranging from obviously supply and value chains, thinking about the relationships between different parts of the UK economy, right the way through to the levelling up agenda. So a great picture to kick off with. So I'm delighted now to move on to our second speaker, Alan Cross. So Alan is joining us today as the Business Applications Ambassador for the European Space Agency, but soon to be the Northwest Space Cluster Development Manager. And Alan's been working on a project looking at the Space Cluster in the Northwest, an area obviously kind of prioritised with the levelling up agenda, but identifying the role of space, bringing together the region's digital and also manufacturing sectors and the roadmap behind that to really kind of exploit the capabilities with regards to space. So Alan, thanks for joining us. I'm going to hand over to you.
Thanks, Tim. This event is so current that as Tim was mid-sentence, I went from being the ESA Business Applications Ambassador, which I was yesterday, to today is my first day. I'm 6 hours in as the Northwest Space Development Manager, hosted by STFC out of Daresbury. I'll talk briefly about my work over the previous 4 years with ESA business applications and how that's led into the development of a Northwest Space Cluster. So the Northwest was rather unique in its position in space, in that it is one of the largest aerospace manufacturing hubs in Europe. It's where we built the F-35 stealth fighter, Eurofighter. Team Tempest is based up here to replace the Eurofighter eventually. We built lots of nuclear submarines. You know, we invented the programmable computer, graphene, all these things. But we're also the largest digital economy in the UK outside of London. And with the UK space economy, as I'm sure you're aware, £16.5 billion worth, around 23% is the upstream. That's the building and design and launch and operation of satellites and spacecraft. And about 71% is digital. It's the use of that data from space in the application of products and services here on Earth. And so with the Northwest being 10% of the UK population, 25% of the aero economy, around 10% of the digital economy, you would expect historically the Northwest to have a real impact, a real position in the space economy. And year after year after year, the evidence suggested that in fact it didn't. Until about 2018, the Northwest generated maybe a quarter of 1% of the UK space economy. And so there was a real challenge between what the Northwest was actually doing, what it was reporting it's doing, and how it related to the space economy. So about 4 years ago, I was brought on board as the European Space Agency's Business Applications Ambassador for the Northwest of England and North Wales. So this is a funding stream focused on funding the commercialization of new products and services. So I was doing all the space stuff that wasn't space. I was supporting sports event photography companies, health companies, companies providing services for utilities, security services, a huge range of companies, all of them using global navigation satellite systems, such as GPS or Galileo, or Earth observation data, or perhaps satellite communications. So this was reaching out into sectors that were not space and helping those businesses to understand how they could integrate space into their operation, new services, and grow, create more jobs, and become more prosperous. About 2 years ago, and I have to thank Colin for this, some really concerted work came through from the UK Space Agency about supporting regional clusters. So these are self-identified, and they have spread up all across the country. Yes, in the devolved nations like Scotland and Wales and Northern Ireland, but also in the northwest of England and the West Midlands and the East Midlands and all across. So I am now, as I said, the Northwest Space Cluster Development Manager. The work that we're doing now is very much focused on those SMEs. It is about helping those companies understand their own capabilities and the routes to market. I'm currently coming to you from the University of Cumbria. I've been at an event today from something called ETIC. That's the Electronic Technologies Innovation Cluster. It's a self-organised cluster of businesses around Morecambe Bay, that's South Cumbria and North Lancashire, who are working in the aerospace sector, working in the defence sector, and amongst other things, they're very interested in how they can access the space economy. Colin touched on it earlier as well. One of the challenges that we face is that it's all well and good me saying to a business, hey, you guys should do space. There's loads of money in it. And they go, great. Okay, what are the opportunities? And I say, oh, that's a good point. And I go back to government or some of the big primes and I say, what are the opportunities for the SMEs? And they say, well, tell us their capabilities. Like, okay, now go back. Tell us your capabilities. And the SME say, for what? And so we've kind of gone backwards and forwards quite a bit. And so there's quite a bit of work that needs doing. Yes, from central government, but also with SMEs on the ground to try and bridge that gap, to try and help the SMEs understand what are the routes to market, what are the opening opportunities, but also to help government and primes identify the capabilities of SMEs so that they know how this can be drawn together. It's a huge task, and that's only really in the upstream. I've yet to really touch on the downstream, on the use of that data in those different products and services. But it's a huge task. Fortunately, working with the likes of Tim and with Colin, it's been very useful to connect beyond our region, to connect out into other clusters, and to see how we in the Northwest can interface with the national space and the defence space strategy in order to power the growth of our own space economy. I think I've spoken quite a bit now. I'll say thank you very much, and I'll step back, and I look forward to continuing.
Thanks very much, Alan. I think some of the points that you highlight there, particularly around the kind of the diversity of what constitutes space, the businesses that play a part of the space economy, absolutely fascinating. And I think the related variety as well, hugely important in terms of thinking what businesses will support the future of the space sector, particularly kind of, again, you mentioned the kind of the difference between the challenges of businesses both upstream and downstream. And we'll draw that out in the conversation, I hope. But thanks for that. So I'm delighted to kind of move on to our third speaker. So Shirley Harrison is the company engagement manager at the AMRC. So as a mechanical engineer by background, Shirley's day job is really helping companies make more sense of emerging technologies, how they can move into supporting growth within their business based on these technologies, and playing part of a variety of different sectors from the AMRC based up at Sheffield. So Shirley, really interested to kind of hear from you with some reflections about the role of organisations like the Catapults and what they play in developing the innovation readiness of SMEs.
Thanks, Tim. Hi, lovely to be here today. Now, as we've already heard just from the first two speakers, this is an extraordinarily complex market. Many sectors are complex, but space really is very complex indeed. And so when new businesses of any size, but especially SMEs, are thinking about joining this market, it's really important to start to understand it. Lots of businesses that I talk to on a daily basis don't really know anything about the space sector, and it feels quite inaccessible to them. So it's very important to engage with lots of these organisations that we've just been talking about, particularly the sort of organisations like the space clusters. There will be, wherever businesses are in the UK, there is definitely a space cluster near them. We have one in Yorkshire and Humber, as well as the other ones that Alan mentioned already. And there are people like the Satellite Applications Catapult to help through those pieces of thinking about what might be suitable. And when businesses are thinking about what they might be able to do, in relation also to what Alan was saying about what's your capability, I think one of the really important things that primes often don't understand is SMEs will often build the capability and the capacity, physical capability and capacity to do things. So if you supply a particular component, but you would like it made out, or made bigger or made slightly differently, often SMEs will do that, will create that capacity or capability to do that. So there's a little bit chicken and egg sort of stuff going on there. It's most SMEs, certainly that I speak to, operate across lots of sectors. So they're not just supplying aerospace, they're not just supplying oil and gas. They are sort of saying, we machine things, what do you want us to machine? And they will do whatever's required. So I think there are three things that any new small businesses need to consider before they enter the space market. First one is, this is incredibly complex. What is it that you want to do? Is it about rockets? Is it about satellites? Is it about launch facilities? Is it about software? Is it about physical product? And what is it that you want to do? The second one is network a lot, so that you really understand the market and the opportunities and where things are going. And the third one is that this is not a market that's about just selling products. This is a market that is about all the things that go around that. This is a heavily regulated market, even if you're doing something quite simple. And so all the things like the accreditation and the traceability is incredibly important. And businesses have to have that infrastructure to support the stuff that goes around the product. It isn't just about, the physical product that you might supply into a less regulated sector. So I think those things are really key. And then I think the other part of it, and this applies to any sector really, I work with businesses on a daily basis who are wondering how to be more competitive. And the way to do that is always to improve your processes. And the way to do that is almost always to implement technology to help you optimize them. And so I see every day that businesses don't understand what's out there. And that's fine because they're busy making products. They don't have the job of scanning the horizon all the time and understanding every new technology startup that comes along that can offer them a product to help them improve their capability or their capacity. That's completely fine, but they have to be able to access that somehow. And organisations like Catapults do that, and that's what we do all the time. So, you know, there are always new products and new commercial offerings and new ideas and simpler and cheaper ways of doing things all the time. So understanding what's available to help your business is really important. Businesses, small businesses in particular, hardly ever have the capacity and capability, the skills and knowledge and the time to be able to actually properly manage change projects when it's for themselves internally. So if somebody wanted to, let's say, automate some process, whether it's using a robot or any other system, the technology will almost certainly work. It is not about the technology not working. It is almost always about buying the wrong technology in the first place because not understanding enough about it. And secondly, even if you have managed to somehow get the right technology, it is about managing people to ensure that, and the systems to ensure that that change is properly implemented. So there's never enough focus, I don't think, on the people aspects of any kind of change. And businesses, and the reason for that usually is that small businesses don't have those people. Which small business do you know that's got someone who manages internal change? I don't know any. So, but there are ways to get around that, and businesses who I know who've successfully adopted new technology have taken a long view on how they can incrementally manage small changes and how they can build that capacity to innovate. I think on that note, I'll hand back over to Tim.
Lovely. Thank you very much, Shirley. So again, the points raised there, thinking about the capability, the capacity of these businesses, we recognise and that the kind of old adage that too many small business owner managers are working in the business, not working on the business. And certainly there are alternatives, and the Catapults provide one of those to try and develop that innovation capability and to help firms think about how to scale. I am going to ask if people have got questions. I know we've got a couple in the chat that I will come to. I'm going to move on to our final speaker before I do come to the questions, though. So I'm going to hand over to Andrew. Andrew's the Head of Aerospace Defence and Space at Reliance Precision Limited. Again, huge experience of working with some of those primes, which I think is really important. And one of the things that really pleased me in having Andrew here today is that he is one of those elusive SMEs that are much spoken about, but often we don't hear their voice. So, Andrew, it's great to be able to have you join us. I'm going to hand over to you for the SME's perspective.
Thank you, Tim. So Reliance was an SME until the end of last year. So we had a very good year and we're just outside of SME territory. But we started our journey in space back in 1999 with our first project being the development and manufacturing of solar array deployment gears for the Rosetta satellite mission. But it wasn't until about 2011 when we really started getting involved quite seriously. And we took on a range of geared products and applications building on our existing unique selling points and values, which was a point Shirley raised in her talk just now, which was about developing IP, developing specialisms, developing skills, developing processes. So we ended up in space purely for that reason. We knew what our existing sweet spots were within the manufacturing industry and within the defense industry. And we transported those skills and expertise into space, which all sounds very simple and easy in principle. But like any new market, it came with its own unique challenges and requirements. And I'm not going to go into detail here about them. Feel free to contact me outside of this for any experience and advice I can give. But I'll run through some of the topics just to give you a taster. So when entering a new market, especially in space, you need to think about the fit, form, and function of your business versus that market requirement. So have you got the volume set up to be able to deliver space products? So if your business is towards the higher end of that SME chain and you're at 200, 250 staff, the chances are the space market, which is predominantly research and development, albeit that is changing, is probably too small a market for you to sustain your business on. But conversely, if you're a new startup and you've got a handful of people, actually space is a great market for you because you bring the flexibility and agility and be able to focus on a specific product or application for your customer chain. I also mentioned that the market is an evolving market. So although the comments I'm making are specific to the way the industry stands today, we've seen with SpaceX and the heavily reduced cost of satellite launch that the number and size of satellites is changing. Satellites are getting much smaller, hence the advent of the CubeSat and NanoSat. And we're seeing significantly more satellites being launched each year, which is helping to fuel growth. So I'd say heed my advice, up to you, but also keep an eye on the direction of travel of the industry. Some of the other challenges include quality management. Again, Shirley talked about this a little bit earlier on. The product you're supplying into the space industry has to be right first time and right every time. And to put some particular numbers on that, a typical R&D type satellite cost is in the region of about £2 billion. And almost every part that goes into that satellite is critical. So if your part doesn't work, the satellite doesn't work, and there's a £2 billion piece of space junk that's just been launched that's then orbiting the Earth. So when assessing your own business for fit, form, and function, you need to be quite critical and honest about whether you have that kind of capability. Other areas to include, and it's quite a hot topic at the moment, is skills and expertise. Do you have the trained, knowledgeable staff to do product assurance, to do quality investigations, to do project management, to do budgeting, especially as some of these projects are really quite lengthy in time, so typically 3 to 5 years. But if I flip that on its head, the industry is very different to others in as much as it's very supportive. You typically have a long customer chain, but those customers aren't fighting with you tooth and dagger to get every last bit of cost out. They're there to support you and ensure that you do a good job. The other significant advantage of operating in the space industry, especially as an SME, is ample opportunity to access research and development funding. So there's at least a dozen different UK-based organisations that have funding pools available to help you develop IP or transition and adapt existing IP to use in the space industry. And the advantage of that is not only the obvious, the access to a new market and industry, it's the IP ownership that goes with it. Unlike certain industries like civil aerospace, the big primes don't expect to own the IP that they're funding via European Space Agency. The other advantage of this supportive environment is that of collaboration. So I'd particularly encourage anybody interested in getting into space to just start talking to people. And the best place to do that is through your regional body. So being based in Yorkshire, we're members of Space Hub Yorkshire, and it's a good place to get involved and to get knowledge from people that are involved and existing players in the industry. That said, it can be tough. Needing to budget, plan, and manage yourself properly is key in this industry, as it is any other. But given the potential values, volumes, and growth that's present in this industry, it's a good one to be in. Just don't necessarily expect to turn up, put your hand in the air, and a purchase order fall on your lap. Do your research, understand who the potential customers are, understand your unique selling points, and then start building that contact network in order to identify where you could position your skills, expertise, and capability within the marketplace. That's all from me, and I'm going to pass back to Tim, and I think we're about to move on to question time.
Yep, fabulous. Thank you very much, Andrew. And I think some of the things that you said there, particularly the evolution of Reliance and thinking about since 1999 when you moved into the sector and how it sits alongside other sectors with which you're engaged with, kind of really interesting, and maybe kind of get you to tease a bit more out on that as we go. So we have got a couple of questions that have come in. So I'm going to take those from the chat first. And I think the first one, and I'm quite happy, I don't know if Colin, maybe you want to pick up on this to start with, given your current role, but also your previous role, thinking about the fact that the likes of France and Germany have very specific strategies relating to SME development. And actually, does the UK need to adopt a similar approach moving forward?
I think simple answer is yes, but just to provide kind of a bit more context. So the government is developing its implementation plan for the National Space Strategy, and it's talking about developing a space sector industrial policy. And I think, as I said in my short intro, the strategy does explicitly mention that different sizes of companies do need different support, different interventions, and that's then got to be reflected into the implementation of strategy and the policy. You can't just have that as an empty statement. So yes, the proposed sector policy has got to explicitly address the needs of SMEs, and I would say it's in the up and downstream. It's not just an upstream issue. And then that needs to reflect into funding programs. I think more of a focus on successful supply chains or successfully building supply chains, a better understanding of government of the capabilities and requirements that it has and how they could lead to procurement opportunities to companies of all sizes, not just necessarily primes, is really important as well. I think the final point I'd make is pace. The strategy was published 9 months ago. We really need to see that being turned into tangible programs and action that industry can benefit from.
No, thank you. I saw you nodding along there, Alan, and obviously 6 hours into your current role, it seems a little remiss to ask me exactly what you're going to be doing with SMEs. SMEs feature within the Northwest Space Cluster Strategy. But do you want to say a bit more about what the vision is for bringing those SMEs together?
Yeah, I think that reflects back to what Colin's just said there. The national space strategy and indeed the defence space strategy are a good beginner. They're good for us to start to get our eye on what we think is going to happen, or to give some kind of structure to that. But what needs to happen now, and this is what I'm hearing from businesses right here today at this Electech Innovation Cluster, is what are the programs? What are the tangible means by which we can access these? And I think those procurement frameworks, taking a look at them and considering the unique needs of SMEs is very useful, and it's not just more than useful, it's absolutely critical. Otherwise, we'll see an ecosystem dominated by large primes. Although saying that, the primes tend not to build stuff, that they tend to then farm out to SMEs and things plug in. So what we're hearing here in the Northwest, again, because we have that lots and lots of SMEs, is the beginnings of frustration into what can central government do to point them in the right direction to get those projects off the ground.
I think that's a really important point. And one of the things that kind of struck me, particularly in the UK space strategy, but particularly within the Northwest Space Cluster strategy, is about trying to bring those companies together. It comes very much back to Andrew's point, I think, about that. How do we build that community, use that network to grow and scale? So I think some really interesting stuff, which is landing in your in tray there. I'm going to move us into the second question, if I may. So the second question from Dimitri here. So Dimitri, kind of a question posed to you, Shirley, if I may, to start with. Thinking really about the kind of the regional intelligence which you have and the catapults more broadly have to really try and understand the needs of companies and guiding them and the uptake and the development of innovation opportunities.
Yep, thank you. So catapults are really focused on bringing together industry, academia, and government. So at the heart of the catapults is the need to bring those things together, and therefore we have access to those three people who can and those 3 points of view, which we can use to drive forward our views on sectors and things. So to take the AMRC as a specific example, the AMRC is part of the University of Sheffield, so we have obviously great links into academia. You know, we are academia, although we're a translational research centre. We're on higher technology readiness level stuff than core research. But we have those great relationships. Equally, our direction of travel in terms of our own research is driven by our industrial partners. So we have more than 120 industrial partners who pay fees to be part of what we do, and it's significant. You know, it's prepaying for research. And those organisations include people like Boeing, Airbus, Rolls-Royce, Safran, you know, all sorts of businesses across many different sectors. Our roots are in aerospace, so there are lots of aerospace businesses and lots of supply chain businesses through those, particularly technology providers, who by definition supply any sector who wants their stuff. And so those that group of businesses, and many of them are at the top of the supply chain, are helping us to ensure that every bit of research that we do is relevant to industry. So we are not ever doing research that we're not sure if it's of interest to anyone. Everything that we do has been directly commissioned or agreed by individual companies or collectively by a group of companies. So I think that's really important in terms of the direction of travel. And then adding into that, we also have our connectivity with governments and research, so that we will be able to feed equally that into the partnership, because the partnership themselves might not be aware of it. So for example, generally, sustainability is something that everyone talks about all the time. All of our businesses that we work with are not necessarily thinking about sustainability. They may be thinking about other specific operational activities. And so us working out what sustainability might mean for them, how we might go about it, how we could help them is very helpful for them. Again, I spoke about this with small businesses, but applies to all businesses. Everyone doesn't have time to scan the horizon for everything all of the time. They have actual businesses to run and projects to deliver and products to get out. And within the same would be within the space sector. You know, people are talking about maintenance in space is a thing that I've heard quite a lot of people talking about as a developing area. Solar power generation in space is something that I've heard people talk about, and some of those things are mind-blowing, but they are also areas where there are real opportunities for businesses to be thinking about and understanding. And so bringing those three areas together is really how the catapults can help businesses to understand what's coming, and then to make sense of it, and then help them to practically implement those things.
I think it's really important, the role that the catapults play, kind of phenomenal, and actually the kind of the scale and the operations of the catapults in reaching more SMEs across the UK, incredibly important. Colin, can I bring you in as well? The experience with the SatApps catapult, similar, different to what Shirley describes at AMRC?
I think it's broadly similar. Yeah, I think the SatApps catapult has always it's been quite a challenging sector, I think, to establish within because of the very broad nature of even just space applications, and now they're broadening out into upstream as well. But I think broadly the experience is similar.
Okay, great. No, thank you for that. So I'm going to move us on to the third question. So the third question from Jen Nellers asks about what is it that's required to enhance the localized capability, and how do we kind of think about that in terms of better links between clusters around the UK? So I can see a couple of people nodding there. I'm actually going to take maybe the slightly curveball perspective and go to the SME first. So Andy, what are you looking for? What would enhance your capability, whether that's from policy, funding, or elsewhere?
Great question. I'd say it's a mix. But I'll put myself in the shoes of somebody starting out. So if you're at the very beginning of the journey, get involved with the local cluster, the local group, build knowledge, build contacts. And really understand what the industry is about before you start investing money and capex. Building on that, I'd say start building relationships and building your knowledge of the funding routes for R&D and grant access. The whole industry has been born out of science projects, very large, very expensive science projects. So if you can understand the routes into access funding, either through the UKSA into the European Space Agency or other routes, that'll help get you speaking to the people that hold the money, but also getting you up to speed with the kind of information and technologies they're looking for. And technologies is the third aspect. So identifying where in a satellite or a cluster or a launch program or within the downstream services, your particular skills and expertise fits, starts enabling you to find who are existing suppliers within that particular subsector. But space is very collaborative. I struggle to think of many, if any, examples where a particular downstream user has funded everything from satellite design through to launch, operation, data download through to exploitation. And that's partly why the market's so collaborative. So as well as looking deep within your technology, look across the pitch to see who it is you could be partnering with or supplying into.
Thank you very much for that. I'm going to come to you, Alan, again, if I may, and thinking about the kind of the Northwest. Obviously, there's a huge amount going on, as you've already described, whether that's kind of cyber and defense, advanced materials, robotics, nuclear in space, another area that was highlighted in the report as well. But in terms of kind of the local capability, bringing some of this together, what's the kind of the vision for the Northwest Space Cluster as part of the strategy?
I'll refer back to what I mentioned earlier about historically the Northwest on paper not doing an awful lot of space, it would appear. And what's happened just in the last few months, if you look at the last Science and Health survey that came through, and the Northwest leapt from 14th in the league tables to 5th, to just behind Scotland. In 1 year, it went, it nearly tripled its turnover, and that was because the businesses were engaged and they responded to the government consultations and the government intelligence gathering on this. And I'll echo what's just been said there. It's about the businesses speaking to each other and understanding where they fit within that ecosystem. We've mentioned there about cybersecurity, about nuclear in space. Specifically for the Northwest, there's not much point to us in the Northwest making a big song and dance about launch, because there are no launch capabilities. There's no launch sites in the Northwest. So we have to focus on what parts of the market we know we're good at, that we're already doing. It's not about reinventing the wheel. And in that same in that same effort, it's about bringing in those local enterprise partnerships, those existing programs. Yes, in space. Yes, ESA business applications. Yes, the UK Space Agency funds, but also, across the rest of UKRI, there's lots of different funds that can be accessed. There are local funds, Boost, for example, which is a Lancashire-based fund. It's helping those local stakeholders to understand what space means, and so that they can target their existing support mechanisms to those businesses. And they have to be speaking to the businesses. Those SMEs need to understand what they're doing, who's around them, what the opportunities are, and how they can link in. And so we work in the Northwest with the likes of the Space Hub Yorkshire, and with the Northeast Satellite Applications Catapult Regional Centre of Excellence, and we operate there as Space North. So we're greater than the sum of our parts. I also sit on the leadership team for Space Wales, and so it's making sure that we're linked in with each other at a deep structural level, so that if an SME wants to know what's going on in Wales, we can connect them straight in. We can't operate in isolation with this.
No, thank you very much, Alan. And Colin, it seemed almost remiss, given that a lot of this kind of fell to you in your previous role, and particularly the work around connected clusters. But the question again was around the better linking of clusters. So with the Connected Clusters Initiative, what was the vision, and how has that played out in the space strategy?
And I think, first of all, I'd really like to echo what Alan has just said. The whole point that we were trying to, we had a hunch that there was more space activity around the country than was being recognized in those national reports. And that was really why we set out that approach of helping different parts of the country to recognize what they already had, and helping to reduce barriers to entry. So when you start to get a local focus, you start to have trusted players saying there is a real space opportunity here, companies will then begin to engage. So I think that development of those regional clusters, and then the plan for how those clusters are going to mature is really, really important. But that connectivity is absolutely the next step, and it is already starting to happen. So the Catapult has for a long time, Satellite Applications Catapult has for a long time brought together its 3 regional centres of excellence to help the cluster development managers to better understand each other and develop those relationships. And that's now being broadened out to national networking events. There was one a couple of weeks back in Leicester, where representatives came from across the whole of the country. And it's not just sitting and listening to seminars, it's then actually meeting people, building those relationships, which help to connect across the whole of the country. So I think we're starting to see that happen. In addition, the Catapult has established a web platform, the Space Enterprise Community, which anyone can join and can post questions on, and can link up directly one-to-one. So there's moves afoot to actually help to bring those clusters together and make this whole UK space ecosystem. But we are just starting on that journey, and there's more that needs to be done. I think the other thing that is going to drive this as well in terms of connectivity is things like the levelling up strategy, which we've seen that the Department for Business has said that is going to push funding, or a certain proportion of funding, to certain parts of the country. And there's actually a reference within the UK Space Agency's allocation to a Space Clusters and Infrastructure Fund, which will be outside the Greater South East of England. And that will certainly help to develop those parts of the country. And then it's really important for the existing clusters that have capabilities and have facilities to really make it very clear how they can be made accessible to companies across the country to help them to grow and to build that connected ecosystem.
Now that really important point, and I think it is evolving, it is taking time, and I think it is speeding up, and a lot of the evidence on the state of UK space, thinking about the growth of SMEs, particularly in that area, really important. And on that note, I'm going to move to you again, if I can, Andrew. We've got a question from Sebastian in Germany, who has asked the question about whether space is understood or operationalized in terms of distance. We've obviously become fairly accustomed to upstream and downstream, but what about low Earth orbit, moon, outer space, and other planets. How does that figure from your perspective?
So it's categorized in a number of ways, and it depends on whether you're looking at from a manufacturer's perspective, or whether you're looking at the kind of services that it delivers. So typically the satellites are classified on size, weight, and altitude, but the size, weight, and altitude typically links to the kind of service they're delivering. So if you need Earth observation or SATCOMs, you're probably going for higher altitude and geostationary, which typically come with long lifetimes. Long lifetimes means larger satellites, longer development costs, and more costly satellites. And at the other end of the spectrum, you can do the same thing at a low altitude with something like a CubeSat, comparatively cheap, readily available, but the lifetime's comparatively short as that orbit decays. In terms of how you take that information and apply it to you and your business and your products, I'd say try and flip it and look at it from the manufacturer's perspective, assuming you're a manufacturer. So if you're into electronics, you could be looking at electrical payloads, power distribution, onboard computing, edge computing. Or if you're into mechanisms and actuation, you could be looking at antenna pointing mechanisms, solar array deployment, thrust vectoring. So if you do some research, have a look at online how satellites are made up, what their major systems are, and start trying to map that against the kind of products your business makes.
Okay, great. Sebastian, I hope that begins to answer the question there that you'd posed. I'm going to jump on to a slightly different tack if we can now. So I'm going to come to you, Shirley, if I may, with a question there from Chris. And Chris has asked about how are we defining SMEs and startups? Are there unique needs to these different firms by category? And how are they being addressed? So maybe take that from the Catapult's perspective to start with.
Yeah, thank you. So first of all, startups are SMEs, so small to medium-sized enterprises. We're hoping that sometime we'll have some new UK legislation following Brexit, but at the moment we're still using the EU definition in most cases, which is up to 250 employees and some things around turnover and stuff. So by definition, a startup is less than 250 employees, so it is an SME. However, the questioner is quite right. They are different and they do have different characteristics, and segmenting SME markets is quite important in the work that I do every day and the work that the Catapults do. So, but also other sort of characteristics apply as well. For example, are you dealing with a family-owned business? Is this a business that's been there through the generations? Or is it a business that's been established for 10 years and you're talking, the person who runs the business is the person who started the business, but it's been established a while and it's maybe grown quite fast, or it's grown quite fast to quite a small size and stayed there? Or is it a business like Andy's was a year ago where it had 225 people in it? So all of those things mean that those businesses are quite different. The way that they're operated will run, the ownership versus management question will be different in each case. The very, very important to understand when dealing with smaller businesses is to understand the view that the owners or managers take on risk. So by definition, an entrepreneurial startup business has a different view of risk than a business that's been established for a couple of generations and is a family-owned business, and the owners are thinking about the legacy that they have and the legacy that they leave. So fundamentally, I mean, those are just a few examples, but there are lots of different things to think about when you are, and to properly understand when you're dealing with businesses. So yeah, there are lots of things to think about, and they do have different needs, and there are broad approaches to it, but mostly we require that we work with them on an individual basis to help understand what people, what businesses' response to things are.
I think it's a really, really important question, thinking about the segmentation. Obviously, micro businesses, hugely different to some in that small bracket as well. So I think the work that certainly kind of the catapults are doing in that space, identifying and understanding the needs, capability, the capacity and the willingness, absolutely critical in making sure the right support's in place. I'm going to jump to a question, and I'm going to bring you in again, Andrew, if I can. So we've had a question again, thinking about how we can best encourage space SMEs into non-space markets. And I think there's a challenge here. Obviously, one of the things we've been talking about this afternoon is how do we get SMEs to think about the space market? Often the challenge isn't necessarily the other way, but what's your perspective on that?
I'd say a lot of the challenges, a lot of the thoughts are the same. So when a business is looking to enter any new market, it's interesting that Shirley was just talking about risk. It is about understanding the benefits that you can bring to a particular market and the risks associated with entering it, and the timescales and complexity to understand the requirements of that industry. So if you were to go and enter nuclear tomorrow, it has its own set of ISO standards, quality approvals, legislation, typical terms and conditions, delivery and safety and quality expectations. So if you're an existing space supplier, the chances are you've got some very, very capable IP that may be particularly niche, having been developed for one particular satellite mission. The first step is to do the market research, to take that IP and work out where in either a commercial or military or civil type application that IP could be given a better mass uptake use. It is normal for businesses to transition the other way, to develop products and technology for general commercial applications and then specialize them for space. But the other challenges for a business going from space to commercial work is the timescales, speed and expectations. If I pick on civil aerospace for a moment, despite it being a key government aim, it's quite a cutthroat business. So to put that in perspective, if you wanted to supply new auxiliary power units to Boeing, you would be expected to buy a brownfield site, to set it up from scratch with a new factory and facility, to man it out and kit it out. So it's almost automotive levels of investment required to do that. And if you're an SME operating in space, you probably don't have the capex and backing to be able to do that, not at least without venture capitalist or partnership with an existing tier one supplier. Okay,
thank you very much there, Andrew. Unfortunately, we've only got time for one last question, and I'm going to come to you if I may, Colin. A bit of a question again, reflecting on some of the history and the kind of antecedents to growth in the UK space economy. So why now? Why is this the moment, and why did this not occur 20 years ago?
I think just thinking back historically, we should recognise that the UK space sector has been a really strong commercial market for a number of years, and government really woke up to this in 2010. For a long time, space was very active in the UK, but not seen as such a high government priority. I think just in terms of why some of these things are happening now, if you think about things like manufacturing in space, better understanding of what you can do in microgravity and what that can deliver in terms of products and services and the value of those. And then you couple that with lower launch costs, you couple that with developments around how you can return samples from space, and you couple that with regulation. And suddenly you start to get a business case which actually stacks up, and the value of the materials that you're going to manufacture are worth more than the cost of manufacturing them. I think more broadly, we've seen a huge increase in space activity in low Earth orbit, and that's really raised the recognition of the issues around space debris and how do we actually make that a sustainable environment. So that's really driven the thinking now on in-orbit servicing, in-orbit manufacture, and debris removal. So how do we keep that environment sustainable, and how do we make better use of the assets that we have up in space? So I think, and finally, I mean, clearly a huge driver is the growing recognition of climate change, and space will not solve climate change, but space can certainly help us to better understand what's going on with our climate and then provide us with the information we need to help to mitigate climate change. So I think, you know, a lot has changed much broader than the space sector over the last 20 years or so, but that's what's driving a lot of the change within the sector.
No, thank you very much for that final reflection there, Colin. So I suppose just to finish, we are seeing this shift within the system of the space economy from silos to a more integrated perspective, and that's absolutely integral. One of the big challenges continues to be reducing the asymmetry that SMEs face particularly, and certainly our speakers this afternoon have highlighted that. So I'd like to thank the speakers for their time this afternoon. I'd like to thank Tiff, Lexi and Tom for their contributions in making today happen. And I'd like to thank everyone else for attending. Please do feel free to follow up with the speakers. I'm sure that they would be willing to share their wisdom one-to-one as well. So again, thank you for joining us this afternoon and have a great weekend.